1595, Abraham Ortelius fashioned an early map of Utopia which, by its very design, was shown to be a fantasy. Although his Utopia followed contemporary geographic conventions, it was full of fanciful names like Nulleville, no place, sans terre, lack of land, or sans eau fleuve, river without fish. Like Ortelius, Shakespeare was a map maker of sorts, who similarly relied on the conventions of his time to create a poetic geography aimed at exploring the unknown. Thus, his plays abound in utopian visions, in no places that could be any places, and in precise yet undistinguishable locations. Such strange and formalized settings served a certain purpose, for they attempted to convey the anxieties of early modern men and women. Indeed, as an instinctive geographer, the playwright projected the fears and vulnerabilities of his contemporaries onto his defamiliarized landscapes, and while his multifaceted utopias proved an efficient means to escape censorship by evading too obvious topical references, his imaginary places simultaneously allowed him to hold a distorted mirror up to the Elizabethan society. Thus, in this paper, I'd like to propose a taxonomy of Shakespearean utopias before focusing on the academic utopia developed in Love's Labour's Lost. And in my third and last part, I will reconsider this particular utopia in order to broaden its scope. So, let's start with a tentative classification of Shakespeare's no places. I have listed 7 overlapping categories of Shakespearean utopias, which I'm going to introduce now very, very briefly. To start with, I'd like to mention Shakespeare's festive utopias. This terminology actually derives from Barber's holiday word, which turns Shakespeare's early comedies into anarchic, Saturnalian play worlds. And the fact is that the festive settings of plays like As You Like It, A Midsummer Night's Dream, or Twelfth Night are all the more utopian and hedonistic in spirit that when Shakespeare wrote them, traditional holiday activities were increasingly frowned upon by the authorities. The second type of utopias is closely associated with the first, as it includes geographic utopias. Indeed, Shakespeare often asks his spectators to imagine a deconstructed green world. That's the case in The Winter's Tale or in As You Like It, a play whose conceptual affinity with Rabelais' Abbaye de Thélème has been brilliantly analyzed by Juliette Danziber. From time to time, Shakespeare also happens to stage a very personal conception of Europe, a non-documentary Europe, in fact, whose derealized features make it paradoxically convincing. Think of Twelfth Night, where Illyria is a fantasy land of make-believe and illusion. Now, a third category could include love utopias, and here Antony and Cleopatra perfectly illustrates my point. In Shakespeare's Roman tragedy, Cleopatra, always associated with the meandering Nile, is regarded as the quintessentially female object and as the origin of heterosexual desire. The fourth type I want to mention in this tentative classification is that of the historical utopia, which is best exemplified by the dying John of Gaunt describing the England he once knew as a special type of place in Richard II, and I allude here, of course, to his famous Sceptred Isle speech. Category number 5 involves economic utopias, and Timon of Athens, with its pre-capitalist society and its idealistic vision of economy, is certainly a case in point, for Timon's display of luxury clearly relates to potlatching. The sixth category encompasses all kinds of political utopias, generally severely criticized by the playwright. Let's take, for instance, the Republican utopia in the Roman sense of the word republic. In Julius Caesar, Brutus obviously perverts the Republican ideal of man's freedom into a terrorist contempt for human life. In the same category, one can also find communist utopias embodied by Jack Cade, who, in the second part of Henry VI, firmly believes in the abolition of private property. And of course, a totally different kind of political utopia is developed by the old Gonzalo in The Tempest, even though critics generally observe that there is hardly any structure in Gonzalo's Commonwealth. The last type of utopia that easily comes to mind as far as Shakespeare is concerned is the academic one. In Love's Labour's Lost, for example, the playwright stages four gentlemen intending to shun the idle pleasures of the world. Indeed, Ferdinand, King of Navarre, and his companions plan to found a male aristocratic academy sheltered from the demands of everyday life. So at this point, I'd like to focus on this last form of utopia in order to show that, in fact, Love's Labour's Lost is not just about the Lord's little academe. The utopian perspective that Shakespeare offers us here proves much more complex and ambitious than it seems to be. Strikingly enough, the beginning of Love's Labour's Lost appears as a reversal of the main argument of Marlowe's Dr. Faustus. In Shakespeare's play, the king and his companions pose as anti-epicures, intending to exchange love, wealth, and pomp for philosophy. In Marlowe's tragedy, Faustus feels, on the contrary, that philosophy is odious and obscure, and this prompts him to discover a world of profit and delight. Therefore, while Marlowe's overreacher says farewell to his vast body of knowledge, Shakespeare's gallants look forward to a banquet of the mind accompanied by the mortification of the body, as King Ferdinand purports to make his little kingdom the wonder of the world. Navarre's academe, however, cannot have much in common with the Platonic Academy of Florence, founded in the mid-15th century, and which was indeed a real wonder of the world. Ferdinand's enterprise does not directly aim at fulfilling the noble philosophical goal of self-knowledge, and it does not seem either to target any specific political purpose. In fact, one quickly realizes that the lords pursue glory and immortality. Right from the beginning of the play, Ferdinand's lines show that the king expects a lasting fame for his ascetic heroism. As Anne Barton puts it, and I quote, "At the very heart of the plan for an academe lies the reality of death, the Renaissance desire to inherit, through remarkable devotion to learning, an eternity of fame, and thus to ensure some continuity of personal existence." End of quote. Of course, if Navarre's obsession provides us with an antitype for theatrical ambition, it also happens to be Shakespeare's. While in Sonnet 19, the poet alludes to devouring time, his third sonnet insistently reminds us that, if thou live remembered not to be, thine image dies with thee. Now, it is difficult to trace the exact literary origin of Shakespeare's academe. while it may be seen as the result of the playwright's familiarity with Horace's epistles, in which the word does appear, it may also have been modelled on Plato's Academy in Athens, which then fascinated many of Shakespeare's rivals. In his Royal Exchange, for example, Robert Greene listed 4 things which do greatly dull the senses, and, as you can see on the slide, women are his first targets. Greene then observed that Plato admitted no auditor in his academy, but such as, while they were his scholars, would abstain from women, for he was wont to say that the greatest enemy to the memory was venery. We cannot say for sure that Shakespeare did rely on Greene, but in his play, the king significantly banishes all feminine presence from his little academe. This, of course, is all the more ironical as the real King of Navarre was thought to be a notorious womanizer by most of Shakespeare's contemporaries. Now, L'Académie Française, a book written by the Huguenot Pierre de la Primaudet and translated into English by Thomas Bowes in 1586, has also been frequently quoted as a possible source for Love's Labour's Lost, given that it had a very great vogue in England. Praising male friendship, the book features 4 noblemen of Anjou who decide to isolate themselves and study together during a truce in the wars of religion. Yet, La Primaudet's work actually provides an analogy rather than a source. And if Navarre follows La Primaudet in banning women from his academe, the boundaries between male friendship and homoeroticism are much thinner in Shakespeare's play than in L'Académie Française. Anyhow, according to the OED, the English word academe appears for the first time in Love's Labour's Lost. Shakespeare uses it twice in Act 1 and in Act 4, where the French ladies are compared to, I quote, the books, the arts, the academes that can contain the entire world. Significantly, as the play moves towards its end, Shakespeare seems to tell us that the study of the opposite sex proves the highest of all academic endeavours. Therefore, in Love's Labour's Lost, if the playwright does mention a typically utopian project implying a form of via contemplativa, it is to debunk and deconstruct it. As a consequence, seclusion is systematically assimilated to idleness. The same idea is developed time and again in the Shakespearean canon, and I will just mention one very short example here. In The Taming of the Shrew, Vicentia complains that, while he plays the good husband at home, his son and servants spend all at the university. In other words, the father stands for via activa, and contrary to his literate son, he knows how to earn and save money. Similarly, in Love's Labour's Lost, Shakespeare criticizes the aimlessness of purely intellectual matters, and toys with the idea of a little academe only to criticize sterile contemplation. It therefore comes as no surprise that in Navarre the young men prove unable to fulfill their roles as academicians, not just because, all things considered, the archaic principle of a womanless world proves impossible, but also because, as lords steeped in Castiglione's ideals, they desperately need an audience responding to their efforts, suggestions, and ideas. This accounts for the fact that the academe remains a virtual one, since before the ink has dried on Ferdinand's edict banishing contact with women, Custard violates the law by having sex with Jacquinetta. Yet, even though Navarre's private academe remains a wishful thinking, one could object that, as the play as a whole turned out to be a great feast of languages, and that's a quote, it is in itself a perfect symposium, a banquet of the mind from beginning to end. What I want to suggest here is that not only does Moth reference to the great feast of languages call Plato to mind, but it also provides an apt parody of one of Castiglione's precepts. In the Book of the Quarter, English readers could indeed learn that having sundry languages was a kind of prerequisite to become a good courtier. In Love's Labour's Lost, Spanish, French, and Italian languages are hinted at, but far from being remarkable features of a courtly society, these sundry tongues characterized a post-Lobserian form of speech in which academic eloquence has become impossible. And this leads me to my third and last part, entitled Rebellion in Navarre. In Love's Labour's Lost, the Park of Navarre provides the main locus of the play, and this utopian green space must of course be related to the late 16th century craze for pleasure gardens. Today, Shakespeare's green world also lends itself to other dreamlike visions. Terry Hand's 1991 production for the RSC, for example, offered an interesting conception of Ferdinand's estate, for his colourful set was French Impressionism turned three-dimensional. Whereas in the first scene, the four lords sat picnicking in a tableau carefully arranged to remind the audience of Manet's Déjeuner sur l'herbe, without the naked women. In Act 2, Scene 1, the garden had been cordoned off with a sign, Interdit aux femmes. Now, Ferdinand's estate is much more than a kind of dramatic Fontainebleau or a picturesque landscape. It is both part of a real world and part of an imaginary place where England, France, and all sorts of faraway countries may be superimposed. Navarre could thus be defined as a Babylonian universe where all nationalities would be able to meet. In his Utopia, Thomas More imagined a coded script to sever the utopians from the outside world. Such coded script proves impossible in Navarre, because the King's Park stands poles apart from the self-contained island of Utopia. External influences flourish in Ferdinand's kingdom and proliferate in the various speeches of its visitors and inhabitants alike. France, with its idle lords and proud ladies, logically comes in for the largest share of satire in the play. Incidentally, in The Touchstone of Complexions, Thomas Newton wrote that the French have sharp and ready wits, prompt and flowing utterance. This description perfectly fits the talkative and witty French ladies. As to the Spanish, when their blood is up, Newton reports that they will rashly and unadvisedly attempt anything. Generalization of that kind partly explain why Armado, whose name was probably enough to shape the reception of the early modern audience, behaves so ridiculously in Love's Labour's Lost, as he capitalizes on both English and French stereotypes regarding Catholic Spain. Shakespeare manages to transform the aggressive feelings of his fellow citizens into a form of cathartic satire. It therefore relies on a geography of displacement, both satiric and anthropomorphic, in order to play with his audience's expectations. In The Comedy of Errors, for instance, the playwright likens several European countries to various parts of a kitchen wench's body. This famous erotic counterblazon must have been inspired by a whole series of maps showing Europe as a queen, the most famous one being that of Sebastian Münster's Cosmographia. Of course, there's no similar counterblazon in Love's Labour's Lust, but I'd like to suggest that if Navarre were a map, it could represent Jaquinetta, the eroticized Derimedes and mock queen of the comedy. The French ladies would certainly occupy Jaquinetta's forehead, and Spain would remain invisible as Armado's boasts dissolve into thin air at the end of the play. To conclude, the experimental locus of Navarre, like many other Shakespearean settings, is no perfect place. But it prompts the audience to create a complex network of associations precisely because it alludes to no place in particular. It is a never Navarre place, so to speak. Now, on second thoughts, Navarre may well be redefined as a heterotopia, which has the power of juxtaposing in a single real place different spaces and locations that are incompatible with each other. Indeed, as Shakespeare makes us imagine an enclosed space comparable to an island, he shows us that there all the arrangements that can usually be found within society are at one and the same time represented, challenged, and overturned. More generally speaking, the Forest of Arden, the Island of the Tempest, Cleopatra's Egypt, and Ferdinand's Navarre, to quote but a few significant examples, are all perfectly localizable on an early modern map. However, if Shakespeare's plays remain so relevant today, it is not because of their topicality. It is because the playwright's extravagant settings make us enter in a never-never world, a world which now, more than ever, we desperately need to dream into existence. Thank you.